Welcome to Digital Assets and Bankruptcy, which is one of three webinars in the Digital Assets and Business and Bankruptcy webinar series. The second in the series. There will be another one later on. The panelists we have, this is the most important thing, are the panelists we have, are two experts. And not only the experts, but I've actually designed this webinar around their expertise. They are Aaron Broderick from Evershed Southern and James Sullivan from Safearth. Ms. Broderick worked intensively in the FTX case. Mr. Sullivan, James, worked intensively in the James, what case was that? Genesis case, yes. There are a lot of Genesis, Gemini, and so forth. We want to make sure we're speaking about the right case. One of the charms of Financial Poise webinars is that they're conversational. This is not a forced march through the PowerPoint. It's a conversation. That's what it always has been the whole time we've had these webinars. And we'll refer to slides as we go, if necessary, if helpful. Otherwise, they're there for your reference later. We will be talking about some slides pretty carefully, I predict. At this point, I think it's time to get started. All right. Aaron, I'm going to ask you a bunch of FTX questions since you know all about it. When was FTX founded? Who were its customers? And what was its chief value proposition to customers and investors?
Sure. So the FTX.com, which has been the focus of the Chapter 11 proceedings and a lot of the news press, was really an offshoot of the sister company, Alameda Research, which started in 2017. It was an algorithmic cryptocurrency trading platform that had a lot of different strategies. It was a market maker. It did arbitrage. It invested in some venture assets. And with the success of Alameda Research, FTX.com, the foreign exchange only available to non-US investors, was opened in 2019. I think that the chief value proposition, and I know we're going to get to this later on in the discussion, was really less about the underlying assets being digital assets and more about the way that trading occurred. So when you looked at a traditional exchange that had a broker intermediary, and you were talking about a futures exchange, and for those that aren't that familiar with how these markets work, if you had an underlying asset and you thought it was priced at $10, right, at a given point, you in a traditional exchange would have to go to a broker and you would have to put up your margin. And so the way that it would work in a traditional exchange is you would have your margin, the trading activity would occur with respect to the pricing of that underlying asset, and that close of business, close of market, you would essentially have a closeout. If you were short on your margin, the broker would call you up and say, put more margin up. And there would be a margin call. And you could actually get into debt for failure to make margin calls. What was revolutionary about the FTX exchange and the perpetual futures product, that was really the value proposition, and we'll talk a little bit about how FTT, the proprietary token, fit into that later, but it was really revolutionary in futures trading in that you had a 30-second closeout futures product where you didn't post margin, you had the assets in your account, and if you fell below that margin based on, or I would say the level of collateral, let's not call it margin to confuse the traditional exchange, but if you fell below your account balance, it would just automatically liquidate. So you didn't go into debt. And you were able to have a larger leeway, if you will, on trading activities without posting margin. And a lot of the margin collateral that was on the FTX exchange was FTT tokens. that end up being worthless. So
Okay, that all sounds
we'll get into that
fantastic,
more.
except for the FTT tokens, but all the rest of it sounds great.
Well, there's arguments on both sides, which we'll get into.
Okay. James, would you like to add to this? Something beyond my pearl of wisdom.
No, so I think one of the things, and Aaron kind of mentioned a little bit, so about the FTT tokens, right? This is sort of like a flaw in some of the crypto cases out there, that there's these self-issued, if you will, crypto assets that are, the value of it is somewhat manipulated based upon insider transactions. Is that really what was going on with FTX and Alameda?
No, that's right. And so the FTT token, proprietary token, and Alameda also played a market maker function with that token. And so it was given out, and it was really the bedrock of value proposition, not just with Alameda, but across the exchange. So you were given FTT as part of your collateral that you could make trades on. And when the CoinDesk article came out, that revealed that Alameda was actually behind 40% of the holdings of FTT, that was the impetus of Binance backing out of the acquisition deal and ultimately the demise and collapse of FTX.
Right. Yeah, interesting stuff.
I think for the purpose of this discussion, I think I'm going to enjoy our circling back the way two hockey players who are about to do a face-off kind of circle around a little bit. I think it's necessary for a topic like this to do that. I mean, I thought what Aaron said was perfectly clear, but if you haven't heard it before, it's good to circle back, and I encourage my panelists to go ahead and do that. Circle away. All right, well then, I think Aaron already answered what my next thought was, which was how does the digital aspect of FTX's wares and services bear upon the value premise? And evidently not very much at all. It was just an excellent story, I guess you would say, that seemed to make trading more popularly available, as well as being very attractive in terms of return.
Well, let me play devil's advocate, right, on that point.
Please.
And so if you take a look at the traditional exchanges and you just look at futures for any other underlying asset, right, you would say, well, the intermediary, the broker, it plays a fundamental role in protection of the investors. And that clearinghouse function and just the time gap and not being 30-second closeouts, right? That breathing room gives investors a time to think. Do I want to top up? Do I want to hold back? Do I want to liquidate? So I think there may have been a false sense of security unique to digital assets because they're on chain. And you think, okay, I have a secure asset here. It's on chain. I know what's happening with it. And I think just the general ecosystem of digital asset investors, they're less risk averse than other institutional investors. So I do think there's something interesting, unique, peculiar about the digital asset investor community, maybe not the underlying asset, but the investor community that certainly contributed to the issues that have occurred not just with FTX, but with other crypto cases that ultimately led to bankruptcy filings.
Sociology had a role, or
Yes.
something that would be explained by sociology rather. And by the way, I love the term false sense of security. That should be the name of a book about this, right? Because security being used not just in the terms of personal security and monetary security, but the very items we're talking about. Well, all right, James, tell us a little bit about Genesis founding and its customers, distinguishing it, if possible, from the FTX
Sure.
scenario.
Yeah, so Genesis was founded in 2018. It was a subsidiary of Digital Coin Group, Barry Silbert. He had a number of digital asset related subsidiaries, Genesis being one, and was operated as a separate legal entity. And they were one of the largest over-the-counter traders and crypto lenders for accredited investors. So probably what they were most well known for, at least certainly what was an issue, a big issue in the bankruptcy case, was it allowed accredited investors to basically stake their crypto assets and to receive interest payments for doing so. They would get like regular statements. They get regular monthly. It's almost like having this, by somewhat of an analogy, like having money in the bank and getting interest, almost like a whether it be a CD or whatever, and a pretty good interest rate, way better than what you'd be getting at the bank, that's for sure. And it seemed fairly risk neutral, right? Because if you're going to be owning these crypto assets anyway, and a lot of the people who purchased crypto assets, it was not as a means of transacting business, but as an investment, right? You're hoping that the value of the crypto goes up. But if you're going to be holding these assets, why not earn some interest also? So that was the value proposition really for these accredited investors. I have these assets that I'm not doing anything with them. Somebody else can loan it out, and you're basically getting interest payments on the side. So that's basically what the business model was. And for the most part, it was doing pretty well up until the time when FTX and Voyager and some of these other crypto companies filed for bankruptcy, because it created a little bit of a contagion. Some of the collateral on some of the loans that Genesis had made to other platforms, went bad. The main one, obviously, was Three Arrows Capital, which was a hedge fund dealing primarily with a lot of digital assets, and probably to a lesser extent, the FTX and Alameda Research. There was certainly some trading between Genesis and Alameda, and there were some claims back and forth and what have you. But I think the major impact that FTX had was less so on the transactions and the fact that there was a lending transaction there, and more so on the fact that it just created a dominoes where FTX went down, Voyager went down, Three Arrows Capital went down. So it was basically a domino that resulted in the inability of Three Arrows Capital to repay a fairly substantial, I think it was a $2.4 billion loan, for which it only had about $1.2 billion of collateral. At one time, the collateral was higher, but because of the value of crypto at that time went down a little bit, they were way under collateralized.
Well, let me go back to the lending aspect. Who's borrowing them, and what are they borrowing them for? What's the purpose of the borrowing? Is that speculation, or what is it? What are they doing with it when they borrow it?
To some extent, it was probably some speculation going on, or maybe arbitrage as between other assets that they have. Could be for a whole host of different reasons, for sure.
And they do something. They use the stuff they borrow, the crypto they borrow, in order to buy other things, or
or you could use it as collateral, perhaps, or there's a whole bunch of things that you can do with it, and that's why it was almost like back in the day when you saw, like, with all the derivatives, and like if there was a domino effect. I think it's the same thing here, because all these crypto exchanges were transacting with each other, right? And so you only really need one or two major ones to fall, and they all sort of like had this domino effect because they all had transactions with the other ones, maybe not directly, but indirectly. And therefore, even if there wasn't major transactions going on between Genesis and some of these other ones, like, because the ones that they did do business with were doing business with these other ones, were doing business with these other ones. So you just need one of these dominoes to fall, and it kind of brought them all down.
Aaron, is there some color you'd like to add to that?
Well, I think one interesting aspect is what was the counterparty clientele profile of the different exchanges. And so FTX was really your FTX.com, the foreign exchange, was really your institutional exchange base. So I totally agree with what James said, but it was a nail in the coffin in that domino effect, right? That was the final and very big domino to fall. Whereas if you look at Genesis or at Celsius, there were, folks taking out loans that were retail investors in this unknown, unregulated asset class that we saw on the FTX US exchange, but a very different profile in terms of the amount of money and the sophistication level on FTX.com.
Well, thank you. But something that struck me while James was talking was his likening of maybe the emotional atmosphere or the semi-knowing atmosphere amongst customers and such was similar or reminded him of the derivatives time when derivatives received the name derivative. Although they might have had that name earlier, it became popularized. And now there's a lot of talk about it, and it seems like a magical way to make tons of money. I remember those days. But derivatives ultimately, because they do have a serious function to play in managing risk for people who aren't, just fortune hunting, for entities, large businesses. I mean, it's a fundamental aspect of our financial economy. Matured to the point where there are, portions of the bankruptcy code that are devoted to dealing with those transactions and allocating risk on that basis or on a certain basis. This is why maybe a theme that we can come back to as we wish in the rest of this conversation, which is, will there be a similar gradient for crypto? I mean, we had these disasters, and we're going to find out that they weren't as disastrous as they seem like they would be. But these disasters and maybe even fraud, and certainly desires to make something out of nothing on the part of lots of people and to catch it before it falls and so on, all of this and fear of missing out, all these other psychological dimensions that were present back then with derivatives and present right now with or certainly a few years ago with crypto. So anyway, that's just something I'm wondering if you or James would like to think about the future of these transactions. Do they have a future besides futures?
James, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there's a future here. Obviously there's a need for regulation, right? In the beginning, the crypto world was sort of like cowboys, kind of investing in things without really a ton of diligence, right? And to some extent, a lot of the investors were risk takers. Like they knew a little bit what they were getting into. It's not the same as mom and pops investing in life savings in a bank, and then when the bank goes bad, there may have been situations where that happened, but I think most people know when they're buying crypto assets that there's an inherent risk there because of the unregulated nature of the market and the fact that the volatility of the asset was unbelievable. So from that perspective, I do think that people kind of knew what they were getting into, but there appears to be, some regulations coming down the pike. We've talked about it in other webinars about new UCC Article 12 coming out, which will allow traditional lenders to enter the space, which will probably provide some stability to the market because, without traditional lending involved, you primarily had maybe some hedge funds, you had maybe some, and a lot of it was coming from other digital companies, like digital asset companies, right? So that's why there was a lot of intermingling between the various exchanges and other crypto businesses. So I think, just having at least the potential for more traditional lending, who will probably scrutinize the transactions a little bit more carefully than some that, I think more of a problem, I think, with FTX, at least with Genesis, you had very sophisticated parties involved. And so I think that's part of the reason why the Genesis case, worked out a little bit differently than FTX, which we'll get into a little bit. But I think there needs to be some stabilizing forces going on to to either in terms of regulation or in terms of an ability for more scrutiny of these transactions?
Yes, I'm going to hold on to that thought about regulatory responses. But I also want to draw attention to, I think I remember that Article 12 webinar you were talking about, since I was moderating it and you were one of the commentators. And it was great fun and I think very informative, and I encourage anybody to find it. It's the first in this series. But enough self-promo. Aaron, how well did customers of FTX do before 2022? And what's the significance of 2022, if you don't mind just forecasting that, foregrounding that?
Yeah, they were doing very well. Doing very well, particularly with respect to the perpetual futures product that I spoke about. It was seen that FTX had some of the lowest trading fees, some of the best, I would call it trading incentives, right? Whether it was FTT or other incentives that again allowed you to, the name of the game is how crypto changed the margin, collateral, view on investors, right? People felt no longer limited because all of a sudden they had more bandwidth to make more money. And I just want to circle back a little bit to the regulatory point, because I think it's interesting when you look at MF Global, right, which was really a futures collapse. When you look at Lehman, largely derivatives based, right? So we think in hindsight's 2020, but when we look at a lot of these crypto cases, we said, well, only if we had these certain regulatory regimes that were in place, right, that dealt with these other insolvencies of banks or brokerages. But the fact is that wasn't a solve all. Futures aren't covered under the Security Investment Protection Corporation Act. They're not, right? So I think whenever you move into a new asset class and you're looking at regulation, and people typically, well, at least in the US, we're all US folks, okay? The US tends to regulate by enforcement. It's after the fact.
Meaning
Somebody did. We rarely do anything when people are making money. And once people lose money, then there's a lot of money thrown at it, right? To say, oh, how do we prevent people from not losing money again? But historically, it's pretty much after the fact, right? And when you look at regimes like Singapore, who adapt very quickly, almost too quickly, probably, right? With providing clarity and certainty and safeguards around, they're doing it already with digital assets, they're going to get squeezed out. So do I think that the US, given the bull run in the crypto market, do I think that it's going to be regulated out of existence or impeded? No, I think there will be and needs to be some disclosure requirements, right? Consumer protection type laws for investors in crypto. But is there going to be a different regime that we're going to enact in an election year? And one that's going to curb crypto investment? I don't think so. I actually think it will be the opposite. There will be incentives to encourage the viability of digital asset companies in general, and obvious safeguards to employ in that regard, but not a complete overhaul.
Well, I just wanted to clarify one thing. Managing by, how did you put it? I'm sorry. Regulating by enforcement. Yes.
Yes.
Regulating by enforcement is roughly what the SEC does, in that it's not putting out codes of conduct and codes that it enforces.
I mean, they're not alone. The CFTC is in there. DOJ is in there.
Think about regulatory incentives, you can understand why they might do that. But it does make it a little harder to predict what's going to happen when you begin an enterprise. But that's just the enterprise starters talking, not me. James, I wanted to ask you the same question about Genesis, but also introduce, let's just, I wanted to introduce the question of inflation. At the time this was all taking place, inflation was low, and yield on ordinary debt instruments was accordingly lower. Do you think some of the go-go in this was the dearth of yield from more traditional investment and lending and borrowing and so forth?
I definitely think,
Genesis. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I definitely think that was a factor. If you're going to hold an asset, traditional, certainly cash in the bank and other asset classes where have a low return. The real difference with crypto though is because I think it's inherently volatile, and I think the people who are owning it were okay with the volatility. They're really investing in it long term. And so the nice thing about Genesis is they gave them a set return, kind of regardless of what the value was at any given moment in time, right? So they knew that as long as they were gonna hold it, right? Because I think a lot of these people had decided that they were gonna hold it regardless of what it was, or at least for a term. They could liquidate it if they wanted to, but it just provided a nice way for them to get a return on it if they were gonna hold it anyway. I'm sure that there were some people that invested in crypto thinking, look, maybe the market is not doing well. I mean, in 2022, I think the market was probably doing, I think it could come down a little bit, but I think a lot of these people were going to invest in it anyway. And they were just looking at, what's a good, where should I invest it? Like, what's a nice consistent return? Looks attractive, so that's the way I kind of see it.
I mean, when you think about the inception of crypto, right, at its core, it was to divorce from central governments. And, again, we're all in the US. We don't have very volatile, we complain about inflation, but it's not 200%, right? Or 2000%.
Right.
For our saving account. We don't get a discretionary surtax from our government when we do business and try to repatriate cash to other jurisdictions in which we operate. So crypto at its heart was meant to get around centralized government and corruption and the like. And you saw that crypto had a huge surge with COVID. Naturally so. People were seeing governments respond in somewhat irrational ways, realize there's a whole marketplace outside of the one that the government should control. And so therein lies a tension of the real intrinsic value of crypto investments, but how do we safeguard those with a government regulatory system that's, again, a bit different in the US, but in many jurisdictions, that the entire point was to curb around them. So that remains to be seen. But I think at a deep philosophical level, crypto investors believe in this, right? That's why even with the collapse of FTX, it didn't wane the enthusiasm of crypto investors. And you see that from the rebound in the marketplace. They believe in this, and they believe it's a need outside of traditional investments and currency.
No, one is tempted to think that he or she knows the type when they see them, by the way they dress or the way they stand. I mean, there's a certain kind of, almost studied indifference to this or that traditional financial convention in terms of the way they present. But that too is probably illusory. All right, well then, Aaron, I want to give you this question first, but of course, James, I like the way you two talk with one another. So then what happened if not, inflation suddenly nudging upward in 2022 to cause all this bankruptcy, make it perhaps inevitable?
Yeah, I mean, I think James hit the nail on the head, right? That it was a domino effect. You had and FTX was a later collapse after Three Arrows, after Voyager, after Celsius. Genesis followed shortly after the FTX collapse. But when you have an asset class where all capital is constrained, you have a classic liquidity crisis, right? And prices just press. And again, going back to the way that the FTX exchange operated is It didn't have margin calls. It didn't give the investors an opportunity to say, do you want to put more assets in? It just liquidated. That's why when you look at the FTX claims composition and its portfolio, it's fiat. It's not in crypto, unlike Genesis, right? It's because all of these mandatory automatic 30-second liquidations were occurring. So when you have capital constraints like that, and all of the players in the ecosystem are involved across multiple bankruptcies, you're going to see prices depressed. You're going to see that issue. Once secondary traders got involved, started freeing up capital, allowing people to get their funds back, put more money right into the investments that they know, you saw a rebound. So I think a lot of it, I mean, obviously there was mismanagement, the proprietary token issue, and failure to disclose what the underlying value was. That all led to it. But I think we make more of that than maybe it needs to be. There's a lot of fraudulent businesses across many industries. And we always, again, we recognize fraud typically in hindsight. Enron, everything was there in the financials, right? But you don't call it out until people start losing money. And I think what was, a bit unique or just again, a repeat of history here it was just every single one of the players was all intertwined. There was no separation. There was no independence. So I think that's what led to it, is that you just had a classic liquidity crunch with the entire asset class being crunched by it being held in a relatively small amount of liquidity providers.
So yeah, James, then please follow up on that. So we have the basic sinful nature of human beings, plus a kind of wonky liquidity situation, and there you have it. Is that it, James?
Yeah. I think it's interesting because I think Aaron hit it in the head, right? So that these automatic adjustments, right? So like if like crypto was not so volatile, right? If it just kind of like steadily went up, like people probably assumed it kind of would. I don't know why, but I think that's what people sort of assumed. Then there wouldn't have been this domino effect, right? Because there would always be probably sufficient collateral, right, to address these things, right? Or it probably just would have disguised a bigger problem, I guess, down the road. I think this kind of thing was bound to happen eventually because there were just too many systemic problems with the way that the industry was set up, and there just weren't enough checks. So I think this kind of thing was just bound to happen. And I guess in hindsight, the nice thing about it was, I guess, in the year or so plus since it happened, at least the crypto assets have rebounded, which made it seem like not so bad for creditors, right? I'm sure there are plenty of FTX creditors who are not happy with the recovery, even though people from the outside may look at it and say, look, you're getting over 100 cents. What are you complaining about? But that's not the mentality of a lot of these crypto investors, right? They're like, well, I see the value of crypto like tripled in the last year or whatever, and I'm entitled to that. That's the mentality. And so, like you and I, maybe we look at it that, and maybe we think they're just being a little greedy, but that's the mentality of these, I think, with the crypto investors, right? And so it's just a very different mindset.
Okay, well then,
I want to just
go ahead, please.
follow up on that point, because I think what was unique about FTX, there's a lot of talk about customer property, right? And ownership arguments, and is it property of the estate? And that's been throughout the crypto cases. But in most of the agreements, it was in plain black and white. We own your assets. We can do whatever we want with your assets. We can loan against your assets. They weren't custodians. FTX was very different in the representations that it made, and serving a true custodial function akin to a brokerage, right? So if we take a look at, again, the Securities Investors Protection Corporation Act and that insurance, would that have helped, right? If that was applicable to FTX, would that have actually helped? Well, in those cases, you still have the filing date as your relevant determination of your insurance protection, right? Which is 500,000. And if it's all securities, it's 500,000, but you only get 250 in cash. And I think there's this confusion a little bit is, well, that doesn't protect you against market losses as of the filing date, right? And so if the securities aren't there, you don't get them back. You just get your insurance. And so in FTX's case, the securities were not there. The underlying crypto assets were not there. But yet the FTX investors, the customers, they're going to be getting 143% return. Best case scenario. Or I would say it's a conservative estimate, but that's a great outcome when you look at the alternatives available, even other regulatory regimes where people say, well, if only we had this, everything would be better. No, it actually wouldn't.
I'd be tempted to say that SIPC would be faster than bankruptcy, except I'm not sure it would be. But on the assumption that it would be, given the tie between the successful returns coming out of bankruptcy cases, both of these cases, greater speed would not have equaled better return for credit.
No, exactly.
Well, I wanted to ask James, since he's our Genesis guy. There's an FDIC, it's much more familiar process than SIPC to most people watching this webinar. FDIC for helping work out lenders, and which was a basic function of Genesis. Do you second what Aaron is saying, or would you elaborate on the analogy between SIPC and FTX and that between FDIC and the lending functions of Genesis?
Well, I mean, certainly that's a possibility, right? One possibility is that, some kind of regulatory regime will step in and that there'll be some entity like a SIPC or CFTC or some other group that would regulate how insolvencies of crypto exchanges would occur, right? Maybe they'll have a carve out a section of Chapter 11, kind of like what they do for those other types of cases. I don't know. I'm not, I certainly haven't heard of anybody really crying out for that just yet, but it could happen.
Good. All right. Well, we've been not just gesturing in the direction of bankruptcy, because the bankruptcy story is essential for both of these entities. And the underlying, unstated premises of this is that it's essential to, or maybe not so unstated, is that it's essential to working out crypto problems. We had an institution called Bankruptcy, each one of us a bankruptcy lawyer, which was called upon to do this, and did it well, not so badly according to the results. I guess my question then is, I'd like to get into some detail then. Some of the people listening to this will be interested in bankruptcy, and I think we can make it palpable enough for them, about how the system works, especially in this situation. I know that Aaron was involved with FTX virtually from the very beginning. I'm not sure about you, James, because I don't know what role tell us about the role you had to play in Genesis.
Well, I represented investors. I didn't have as big a role probably in Genesis case as Aaron had in the FTX, but I was involved enough to be able to explain to you exactly how everything sort of played out. But I think one of the things that might be interesting to talk about would be, and Aaron kind of talked about it a little bit, touched on it a little bit, is this whole idea of should bankruptcy claims be dollarized when you're dealing with crypto assets,
okay,
right?
Well, let's stop right there.
Mm-hmm.
Claims are the coin of the realm in bankruptcy, and they're obvious. Maybe it's obvious to everybody, but it's a terminology. It's what people are owed, and they establish that by filing a claim. And now, whatever the outcome of the case is, has to take account of that claim, has to make it a decision, which is voted upon, right, about how much that claim is rewarded, if anything, because often claims are not rewarded with anything. But go on from there, please.
Right. So like in a traditional bankruptcy case, right, every claim is dollarized. In other words, if your claim is based upon land, you're not going to get land back. If your claim is based upon, let's say, euros, they're going to convert it to dollars typically, right? If your claim is based on, every claim gets liquidated into dollars. That's just the tradition of U.S. bankruptcy, right? But so all of a sudden you have
Well,
these
it's a
crypto
bankruptcy code
cases.
requirement. We should say that. It's a bankruptcy
Yeah.
code requirement. And there's not a lot in the bankruptcy code that can't be modified with some discretion of the bankruptcy
Right.
court. But this is one that can't. Your claims have to be valued as of the petition date in US dollars.
But nobody wanted dollars, right? Like, and in
Are they
FTX,
creating
it's
the
different
first
because there was no very little crypto assets left. But in Genesis, for example, there were substantial crypto assets, and the creditors don't want dollars, right? They want the crypto assets because if they get dollars, then they're going to have to recognize because a lot of these guys bought the crypto assets when they were worth like almost nothing. And even if the market was a little bit down in 2022, there is still going to have a huge tax liability, right? If it got dollarized. So there was this huge incentive for this creditor class not to dollarize the claims, right? So and this was before anyone knew that it was going to the value of these crypto assets were going to triple in the next year, basically, right? So even if it was at that lower level from 2022. Large chunks of these creditors did not want dollars. They wanted their crypto assets back because otherwise they're going to have to write a big check to Uncle Sam. So I think that was a big part of what was going on.
Yeah, and I mean, again, hindsight's 2020.
Mhm.
While they wanted their assets back, and I don't know how long Genesis was in bankruptcy and when the distributions we made, but it's at least a year and a half. And so at the outset of the Genesis case, there was a determination that we're going to hold our crypto assets because our lending arrangements are in-kind distributions to the lenders, right? They're very different than the FTX accounts and the customer accounts. But query whether if the Genesis fiduciaries would have sold those assets, right, at rising market prices, would the recoveries be better than what the in-kind recoveries now are? Right? Because it's still based on your on your pre-petition dollar claim, if you will. It's just you're getting paid in crypto, and you have an accretion top up, if you will, for your particular asset class. But if you run the numbers, if there would have been a prudent monetization policy throughout the bankruptcy case, would there not have been a higher overall return to customers?
In Genesis,
The
probably
creditors?
not.
Creditors?
But certainly in other cases, like a lot, I know it's a big issue in the first day of the case, right? Any debtor that has substantial crypto assets, should we start to have some kind of liquidation scenario just because of the volatility of crypto, right? And so the U.S. Trustee's Office is sort of like, I think they like a responsible liquidation program just to kind of minimize risk to creditors, right? But you had an overwhelming huge chunk of the creditors in Genesis that didn't want to do that, right? And so they didn't.
Do you
So
know
yeah,
what the portion of the assets in Genesis were BTC and ETH are like appreciating crypto? Because that's probably the big difference, right? From FTX and its
big chunks were Bitcoin and Ethereum, right? So there were some others, but those were probably two of the bigger ones.
Aaron, and the distinction you were driving at is that what was it? Was the principal crypto in FTX was FTT?
FTT, yes.
Yes, and so FTT didn't have the liquidity. It didn't have the demand to hold it and to have it that BTC would have. And therefore we're talking about two fundamentally different worlds in a way between Genesis world and FTX world.
Well, and sure, I mean, to be clear, right, FTX was a global exchange, so a lot of BTC was traded, and I think probably had the lead position with respect to the futures trading of Bitcoin. But at the same time, like because of that automatic liquidation, the actual claims that we're talking about in bankruptcy ended up being in US dollars because they were those positions were liquidated. So that there's a difference there in just the nature of the financial products. But, you know, FTT has been subordinated even to equity in FTX, but the diversity of its coin portfolio as of the petition date, I think was very different than Genesis. And that was the point that I was making about the value proposition in liquidation of certain assets versus holding them. If you had a high concentration in BTC and ETH, and that's also the contracts asset denomination, you would keep that because you're paying out same to same. It was apples and oranges, you know, apples to pears, apples to vegetables in FTX, and that you did not have that asset liability match like you did in Genesis.
Both cases, I think Genesis is basically, which one's done already? Is it Genesis?
Genesis's plan was confirmed, and the distributions
That's right.
are basically in process. It's, you know, if it hasn't happened yet, it's going to be happening in the very near term.
And FTX is a little bit more. Please describe it.
Well, so FTX has its disclosure statement hearing on the 25th, so next week, and hoping to move to confirmation by October.
Okay.
So we could see an exit from bankruptcy this year.
Yeah, so about 2/3 of a year behind Genesis, perhaps. Well, we have enough time to get into a little bit of inside baseball on on the variety within each case between different classes or different groups of interests, how they did as far as distribution, and the inside baseball of not paying, you know, dollarized amounts in each case. As you mentioned earlier, Aaron, the code, of course, didn't have crypto in mind when any part of it, even the more recent additions were made, let alone those made in 1978. You know, how we got around this problem of dollarization, which seems to have been required or understood in the drafting of the code. Why don't we start with that, and then I'll get to James on Genesis, how the different classes, if you will, were treated, and then back to FTX. So that should fill up the rest of our time pretty well.
Well, you should start with James on how to get around dollarization.
Okay.
Because we did not do that in FTX. So I'll let him start there. And then I think one point of unison that's really important in these cases is the government's role and the government and claimant's role. So we'll touch back on that after James answers.
Good. James.
Yeah.
So what's this without using dollars? What's wrong with you? Are you not a American or something? What's going on?
So Genesis was highly negotiated. You know, there's negotiations going on from the beginning of the case, and everyone thought, oh yeah, it's going to settle, and then, you know, somebody wouldn't quite agree to it. So the amazing thing about, I think the interesting thing about Genesis is the fact of the role of the government, really, right? So the New York Attorney General originally filed a $1.1 billion claim on behalf of the investors of the Gemini lender program, right? So, and other creditors, you know, started talking to the, you know, the New York Attorney General and said, well, you know, what about us, right? And so New York Attorney General was like, okay, I'll amend my claim and make it like $3.5 billion. And so, you know, the interesting thing about it is that they sort of had enough influence on the New York Attorney General to ask for things that were going to benefit the creditors on a whole. Normally, you don't have a creditor asking a governmental agency to file a larger claim, right? Because it's going to dilute them, right? But it didn't here because the New York Attorney General agreed to subordinate the claim to all the creditors, and it was just going to be senior to the equity. Because the major problem here was you had equity arguing that to the extent that the value of the crypto went up and created value, like if you dollarized all the claims, right, at least according to equity, then if you took out the government claims, there's enough money to go to equity, right? And so none of the creditors wanted to see that happen. So they convinced the Attorney General to file a very large claim to moot the issue as to whether or not the claim should be dollarized. Because if you, with these government claims in place, even if you dollarize them, then there's not enough monies to go to equity. And so the judge found that based on prudential standing, equity lacked standing to argue that the claim should be dollarized. So it never got litigated in the case. It just got mooted out because only equity was making that argument, right? And because they can't argue it on behalf of somebody else who's not aggrieved, the court wouldn't consider that argument. Everybody else is agreeing, yeah, let's, here's the structure, this very highly negotiated plan structure where cash creditors are going to get paid 100 cents, probably plus interest, right? So, and then you have crypto claims. They're going to get crypto assets in return to the largest extent possible. It's not going to be all of it, but it's going to be a large chunk, probably.
That matched the volume and type that they had.
Yes. Well, they were going to try to. So to the extent that they couldn't, there might have to be a little bit of massaging and wiggling to get around that. But for the most part, they were going to try to maximize the likelihood that you'll get back what you put in. And then on a pro rata basis, to the extent that there's monies left over that would go towards those New York Attorney General claims, the monies would get distributed to the creditors on some kind of pro rata basis. There was this whole basically waterfall kind of structure that was set up as part of the plan. And it's going to allow a lot of these creditors, for example, the Gemini lend program, those creditors, they're probably going to get made whole. So at the end of the day, if not like very, very close, even on the argument that they were making, right, getting back their assets, not on the basis that FTX is talking about, right? They're talking about over 100 cents, right? But that's only on the basis that they're not getting the benefit of the appreciation and the value of the crypto. So the creditors in the Genesis case, some of those creditors are getting back, basically being completely made whole. Certainly the cash creditors are, and probably the Gemini creditors are probably going to be made whole, or at least close. And then the others are going to be, they're still going to do pretty well, on the grand scheme of things, because of the fact that the crypto assets have appreciated so much. If you're doing it on a dollarized basis, they're getting back much more. And then equity's not getting anything. So it's pretty interesting how in this particular case, the government played a very important role to kind of eliminate that argument from the confirmation fight, and really allowed all these conflicting creditor constituencies to reach an agreement. So I thought that was kind of amazing.
Well, and what a contrast to the apocalyptic ways people were talking about it before 2022. Mm-hmm. General rise in crypto, and then the maturity of these cases coming the next year and this year. So Aaron, what happened over there in FTX land, and how was it worked out? What were the principal genius moves by the negotiators?
Sure. So I'll start with what's dissimilar to Genesis, and then I'll end with what is similar, right, on a point of unity. So the claims for crypto appreciation have been ever present in FTX from the start, right? If you had BTC in your account, or Solana, or like you want your in-kind distributions, you want a different valuation date than the petition date, etc. Again, very different situation in that there was a shortfall, there was an inability to make in-kind distributions. And I think a very important thing when people are looking at this from the outside is that if I held BTC in my account and I made a prudent decision to liquidate, or I was part of a perpetual futures program, which was the sort of the value engine of the exchange, I had a fiat claim, right? That doesn't mean that I didn't have a depository account for currency. I was invested in BTC, and I made a prudent decision to try to liquidate to get it off before the exchange collapsed. So those that were still invested in the crypto, arguably, you made a wrong investment
Right.
choice, right? Because the exchange went out. So just very different circumstances in the way that we look at the claims and the ultimate return profiles. I think it was the right thing to do here to treat all the customers the same and not discriminate with respect to the asset class, just given the nature of the investment. So I think it turned out correctly. I think you'd see a big outlash if you said, okay, if you were in BTC, you get a 300% return, fiat, you get nothing, right?
Right.
Part of what made the 143% recovery possible, a big part of it, is that the government, the IRS, the CFTC, and a number of state agencies agreed to subordinate their claims to the recoveries of not just customers, but general unsecured creditors, so that we were able to offer a 9% post-petition interest rate through the date of ultimate distribution on your principal amount of your claim. Now, that wouldn't have been possible without those government agencies saying, we're going to subordinate, because it's not a solvent case.
Do you mind if
Just
I
like in
stop you
basic.
there? Because, the touchy-feely relationships with government are not common among those who are subject to government claims. To put it mildly, they have the guns and tanks and nuclear weapons, and you owe them something. They want it.
Well, yeah, and so here's
Here
what's
that didn't happen.
interesting about the IRS claim, right? The IRS had a claim that was 44 billion, went down to 32 billion, ended up getting reduced to 8 billion. And the thing is, though, is where the liabilities we're not at the FTX.com exchange where the asset value was. It was at Paper Bird, little known entity that controlled the ventures portfolio, and at the Alameda Holdco. So if we really were to unravel everything in FTX, IRS probably would have been structurally subordinate. So it had an incentive to subordinate its claims already. And there's also a tax directive from basically akin to the United States Trustee's Office giving guidelines. This is the Internal Revenue Service giving guidelines to the DOJ, IRS tax department, saying where there is a constructive trust established for victims of fraud and Ponzi schemes and embezzlement and misappropriation, then the IRS should subordinate its claims to victims. So there was also that general guidance of urging the IRS to do this. And with the CFTC, their claim is ultimately on behalf of the victimized customers, right? So I think it makes a lot of sense in equity. And we've created some novel points of law between FTX and Genesis that hopefully will inform future cases and maybe some of the regulatory direction that we talked about earlier.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question right out of left field, which occurred to me as you both have been speaking. When we talked earlier about SIPC and FDIC, which have the areas in which they operate to protect investors and depositors and so on through a set of rules that they have, and they have institutions by which to do it, none of which apply to these cases, and so therefore went through bankruptcy. Have there been any crypto cases that went through federal equity receivers, for example? That's a not so well-known way of handling a collective, claims situations, right? I mean, I can't think of one case, and the looks on your faces suggest that
I don't know. I don't know if it's the right answer, but I don't know of one.
But I think now, because of the successes of these two cases in particular, and they're not alone, that's such a, federal equity receivers have broad discretion, sort of like the creativity you were discussing in connection with FTX in particular, broad discretion to go after or ease up on or craft collective solutions to situations where people aren't going to be paid in full for some catastrophic malfeasance, for example, which arguably was the case more in FTX than in Genesis, but let's say it was, then it would be a better candidate for that. But the the federal equity receivership remedy hasn't been used, and that's just a question I have now that I thought of it while this webinar was going on. but maybe it's just a stupid question because now we have some experience with dedicated professionals from various parts of the bankruptcy world coming together and hashing it out for the benefit of creditors in ways that can be replicated and modified by other cases.
Well, I think there's a definitional hurdle for the eligibility of those proceedings with the nature of the crypto exchanges, and that they haven't been defined as securities yet.
Right.
And so there are a number, right, of different regimes. But I continue to think it's the square peg in the round hole analogy, because there's a lot of regimes where it kind of looks like crypto, but it's not a perfect fit. And I don't think that, again, with the election year and everything else going on, I don't think that we're going to see a complete overhaul. But we will start taking lessons from the bankruptcy cases, and those can be underpinnings, if anything, for just special provisions in the bankruptcy code
Exactly.
to address the crypto cases.
Yeah, because I don't see the government agreeing to insure this asset class at all, right? So that's really the basis for having these other federal regimes, right? There's like an insurance, out there to protect customers.
Well, remember,
So,
it's a pure thing, right? Like
yeah,
the banks pay in, right? The brokerages pay in.
yeah,
So you've got to have a collective, and when everyone's bankrupt, and it's great, literally, and scrambling around to recoup capital and figure out their business plans in a very uncertain regulatory regime, I don't see a buy-in from a market perspective, and there certainly doesn't need to be any boost to investor confidence, because again, we're in a bull run. So
yeah.
I just don't see it happening.
Well, I guess I'll finish this webinar by observing that obviously from the evidence before us, bankruptcy practitioners are the more thoughtful choice than some of these other areas would be, and therefore let's just leave it with the bankruptcy professionals. It's probably the best way to go.
I like that conclusion, Chris. Thanks.
Yeah, me too.
I'm very grateful for the contributions of James Sullivan of Safebarth and Aaron Broderick of Eversheds and Sutherland. Thank you all for listening, and let's get together another time. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.